feel like your builds are missing something? Well, gradients are here to help. A gradient is a way of texturing where you create a smooth transition from one block to another. When you make gradients, you don't look at the names of the blocks, but rather the colors. So whether a block is called diorite or calcite doesn't matter when it looks like bird shit anyway. So you can take these two similar blocks and place them together, and take another similar block and place it next to that again, and keep going until you eventually get a gradient. Making gradients is all about placing similar blocks together and thereby minimizing contrast, so you need to remember that contrast is the enemy. There are 3 types of contrast you need to watch out for when you make gradients, and I'll be going over each one of them to make sure your gradients don't look unfortunate. And the first type of contrast is hue contrast. A hue contrast is the difference between colors depending on where they are on the color wheel. The further apart 2 colors are on the color wheel, the bigger the contrast and hue is. For a smooth gradient, don't throw in blocks with different hues midway if there's a consistent pattern, even if the blocks are very similar. But do not worry, this problem is easy to fix. As an example, let's take a look at this failed gradient. Its use of cyan shades is consistent, but then this blue block comes along and ruins that consistency. And as you can see, having a blue block in the middle of a gradient that only uses shades of cyan looks very strange. We can fix this gradient by simply replacing the incongruous ugly blue concrete block with a shade of cyan to match the rest of the gradient. And just look at that difference, oh my gosh! And the second type of contrast you need to consider is value contrast. Value is how light or dark something is regardless of its color. 2 blocks can look very different, but applying a black and white filter can make them look identical because of their similar values. And this is something not enough people think about when making gradients. This gradient goes from an emerald block to a redstone block. At first glance it looks like a gradient from green to red, but when we put this black and white filter over it, we can tell that it's also a gradient from lighter values to darker values. However, there is a flaw in this gradient. There's a sudden block with a way darker value in here. You've probably spotted it by now because even the colorblind aren't exempt from this ugly netherrack. We can fix this gradient by replacing the netherrack with another block that has a lighter value, and just look at how much nicer that is. Here are some examples of how values can look in a gradient. Dark to light, and here we have dark to light to dark, and then one value throughout the entire thing. The thing you'll notice throughout all these gradients is that there's a consistency in their respective patterns. When a gradient very clearly is supposed to go from a dark value to light value, there's not a random block with a darker value in there somewhere. So the values in your gradients can really be anything you want it to be, as long as there's a pattern. You don't break the consistency. If you ever feel unsure about the value of a block in your gradient, apply a black and white filter over it and take a look at how it looks next to its surrounding blocks. There we go. You might have heard people say that gradients are all about colors and not textures, and although this is true, you might still want to consider the textures of the blocks you choose. Because just like with hues and values, there can also be contrasts in texture. Take a look at this gradient that goes from deep slate to copper, for example. The raw iron block with its very roundish texture looks out of place next to the perfectly smooth copper block. The gradient does look okay when you move further back, because then you don't see the texture, you see the color. But if we're building at a scale that isn't super huge, it will look very odd. So if this is something you're concerned with, you should base how big the contrasts in texture are on the scale of your build, to avoid ending up with what some call block vomit. However, this doesn't mean that it's impossible to make a good gradient for a smaller scale build with this block. Here in this other gradient, I've placed the raw iron block with other blocks that have similar roundish textures, and if we apply both of these to smaller builds, this gradient's consistency and texture looks significantly better than the other one. So yes, gradients are about color, but texture can also play a big part in the quality of the gradient, depending on what scale you're building in and your personal preference. So sure, as much as scale does play a big part in how much you should consider contrast in texture, ultimately it's up to you. Some people love the very textured look, while others despise it and call it block vomit. Just make sure whatever you're going for doesn't look extremely messy, and you should be good. Oh, and do not under any circumstances use shulker boxes in your gradients. Why? There it is, and boom, it's gone. You see that? Okay, there it is. It's back again. Oh, boom, it's gone. Don't use shulker boxes. Please, do me a favor and don't use shulker boxes. Gradients can have more than one layer. And what do I mean by that? If you're building with various stones, add a layer of glow lichen for that extra smooth transition. But beware, this might look weird at night or if you're using shaders. If you're making gradients with skulk or from blacks to blues, you can use skulk vein to smooth it out. And if it's mossy, add some vines. And if you're in 1.21 and building with copper, you can even add a layer of trapdoors or copper gray. great. If you don't know where to start when it comes to making gradients, there are a couple of websites you should know about. And the first one is the HuBlocks Gradient Generator. You select 2 blocks and the length of the gradient and it generates a block gradient for you. It may suggest some strange blocks, but it's a great starting point if you're stuck. The second useful website is Block Colors. Here you can pick a color or enter one and it gives you matching blocks. This website is especially great if you're going for realism, as you can pick colors from the images you want to replicate, enter them, and it gives you matching blocks. Now that we've gone over how to actually create gradients, let's apply them to some builds. Gradients can be a great way to improve your builds, if done right. You can slap a gradient onto literally anything to improve it. Roof looking boring? Give it a gradient. Third house looking bad? Gradient. Halfway looking unnatural? Give it a gradient. But how do you actually do it right? Well, first of all, you need to remember that gradients are called gradients and not suddens. They should steadily go from one block to another without any straight lines or consistent pattern, which just makes it look unnatural and gross. Gradients can be used to draw your eyes towards certain places. If I want to make this tower appear taller, for example, I can give it a gradient that gets lighter towards the top, which draws my eyes upwards, thereby making it seem taller. But your gradients don't have to cover the entire surface either. It can be just at the bottom, only at the top, or wherever you think it looks the best. A gradient doesn't even have to be the same length consistently. It can be longer in certain places or shorter. All this can be a bit difficult, but marking where you want the gradient to be can simplify the entire process. This can look really awesome when done right, especially when used to emulate weathering. When you hear the word gradient, you probably think of something basic like this. Ew. But did you know that gradients can go in all sorts of directions? Left, right, circle, spot, inverted spot. There are really no limits. And how you go about this depends on what you're building and what your reference images are, and this is something I'll elaborate on later. If you ever feel unsure about your blending of the blocks, take a big step back and get a good look at it. It's usually pretty obvious if it's working or not. If a build is smaller, it's usually better to avoid bigger gradients and stick to more subtle ones, as there's less space to transition the colors on. However, that doesn't mean that it's impossible, because like I said earlier, this is just a matter of personal preference. This build, for example, is pretty small, but it still has 4 different gradients on the entire thing. So it's all about finding the perfect balance and making sure it doesn't look extremely messy, and you should be fine. Making a decent gradient is one thing, but if you truly want to blend it into an environment, there are a few additional things that you need to consider. And the first thing is the age of a build. Older buildings will generally have more variation in texture, while newer ones will have less. So remember, a build can be old and well maintained, or modern and abandoned. So find reference images of what you're trying to emulate and build accordingly. The second thing you should consider is the weather something's experienced. Just think about literally anything a building can have and add it. I'm talking moss, discoloration, stains, swelling, efflorescence, water damage, and even peeling paint. Finding accurate block matches to what you're trying to make can be tricky, so this is where the block colors side comes in handy. The third and last thing you should consider is the traffic a build's been exposed to. For paths, floors, and roads that experience a lot of movement, you should show wear by using gradients to make them look worn down. Start by placing smoother or more polished blocks in areas with less traffic, then place darker, more rugged, or cracked blocks where foot or vehicle traffic is the heaviest. And now create a gradient between the two just like you'd make any other gradient. This adds a lot of realism to your build and makes it a lot more visually engaging. Now that we've gone over all that, let's show how applying it to a build actually can look. I'm someone who likes to plan out the gradients before I start building, as I consider them to be just another part of making a block palette. If you know that you'll be using some pretty big gradients, it can be smart to lay them out together with the rest of the block palette to see if it looks harmonious. I started with gradientifying the bottom of the house with some moss. I would have gone for a bigger gradient here, maybe even something with diorite in it, because I love diorite. I'm a bird shit lover, but I opted not to, as there isn't that much space to actually transition the blocks on, and I personally do not like block limits. And now for the house part of the house. Here I started by adding the darkest block in the gradient, as that sort of contrast lets me better see the shape of the gradient and it makes it easier to envision how the transition is going to go. I find that doing it like this works very well if you know exactly what you want and how you want it to look. With this roof, the shape is more unconventional than other surfaces, so making it very clear where I want the transition to go simplifies everything. After placing down the diamonds, I gradually made my way towards the top with the transition blocks. And then I added the skulk and glow lichen to smooth it out even more. And this glow lichen, I don't know how to pronounce it, looks atrocious at night. So I figured making the entire roof glow wouldn't hurt. And for this step I used the light block, like the lights everything. And you might think, wow, that's it, the gradients are done, but nah. I made a pond as well, and ponds aren't exempt from the gradientification. Given ponds and other things in nature, gradients adds a level of depth to them like nothing else. And wow, there we have it. This looks awesome in my opinion. I want to eat the roof of this house. Gradients can make even the worst of houses look good. Beautiful, magnificent even. So use this knowledge at your own risk. Just who knows, maybe you'll get so good at gradients that you think you don't need to know anything else. But oh, trust me, you do. Maybe you should watch the 8 simple ways to transform your Minecraft builds tutorial. You know what to do. Okay, anyway, subscribe because more tutorials coming soon, and bye!